Welcome to the podcast where we celebrate innovation for a happy planet. I am your host, Abigail Carroll. Before we get started, I wanted to give a shout out to fellow Maine angel Bobbie Lamont for supporting the podcast. She is a tremendous force in the Maine startup ecosystem, and I'm honored that she's supporting the podcast. She will receive a beautiful Happy Planet hat in return. And if you are interested in supporting the podcast, by all means, visit our website, happyplanetpodcast.com. There you can purchase a hat and receive a shout out on the podcast. So thank you once again to Bobbie Lamont. We are kicking off a new season, and today I'm just delighted to have a very special guest on the podcast. His name is Jason Dodier, and he's a recognized global authority on the circular economy, biochar, and decarbonization. He is also an unbelievable community builder. Jason co-founded GRAIN Ecosystem, an AI and data-driven solution that revolutionizes waste to energy products. GRAIN Ecosystem positions biochar, which we will be hearing a lot about today, as the cornerstone of carbon sequestration, community development, and project financing. And as though that weren't enough, Jason also co-founded Fountainhead, Rhode Island, a community fostering environmental startups and leadership in Rhode Island and beyond. In this podcast today, you will hear references to the most recent Fountainhead, Rhode Island event, which was a phenomenal success and where I had the great pleasure of having a live podcast stand. But enough from me. Let's hear it from Jason. Welcome to the podcast, Jason.
Thank you for having me, Abigail. It's a thrill to be with you virtually and having met you live not too long ago at our big climate stocktake event.
Well, that was a delightful event. Why don't we start there? Tell me a little bit about Fountainhead, Rhode Island, and what you've built there and where that's headed.
Sure. It's a privilege. This year is actually our 10th anniversary since the founding of Fountainhead, Rhode Island. You know, for me and my co-founder, David, who you met at the event, the whole purpose of Fountainhead was action always comes first. And for the last decade, we've worked kind of at this intersection of government, community, and innovation to really try to move ideas into momentum. So while climate is certainly one of the pillars, and you saw it out in full force in Rhode Island a few weeks ago, our mission goes beyond that. It's really driven by priorities of the people we serve. So we've done events and focal groups around mental health, financial literacy, housing, obviously, which is a huge passion for Rhode Island House Speaker Joe Shikarchi, who you interviewed at the stocktake, food security and healthcare. And, we're responding to what matters most in Rhode Island, but it's actually evolved to much bigger than Rhode Island over the last, I'd say, especially since the pandemic as we went virtual. But the real ethos of founding Fountainhead, Rhode Island was really two things. 10 years ago when I was living internationally, bringing more diversity in international companies to Rhode Island, and also we couldn't write big checks at that time to help nonprofits, groups like Crossroads RI, Better Lives, Parkinson's, etc., bringing our expertise to bear, free legal, free accounting, free marketing services, etc. So really proud to see what Fountainhead has become. And obviously, as you know, we hosted the second annual Rhode Island Climate Stocktake, which was a big success. And I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit more in the discussion today.
Well, I thought it was a particularly interesting cross-section of people, although we were there very much so in a climate context for that specific event a few weeks ago. I interviewed people from Schneider Electric and from a local union organizer, and it was really interesting to see the shared priorities and the shared momentum of all those stakeholders at that event.
Yeah, and I think that the mindset I had was, why shouldn't this small but mighty state, which is already leading, as you know, in a lot of climate policy and innovation, host an impactful climate event? And obviously, where else can visiting companies sit down with the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker of the House, head of the labor union, as you mentioned, the head of Commerce Rhode Island, and lots of potential pilot partners in the span of a few hours. I know for you, it was a whirlwind. I saw you over there interviewing some incredible thought leaders and key stakeholders. And I think what energized me about the event was, the caliber and the commitment. And I'll just flag one last thing. We had people there, I don't know if you saw it, Abigail, from as far away as Australia, Germany, the UK, and beyond. So keeping with the thematic of resilience and security, I could see that interconnected nature of places, both that are near and dear to my heart, places like the Bahamas, which was exhibiting there, obviously
Yeah.
leaders from New York City, Manhattan, and across Rhode Island and around the world. Just thrilled with the outcome, and hopefully we'll go even bigger next year.
Well, that's great. Really excited for you. And it was an honor to partake in it. You also have this other company, GRAIN Ecosystem, which you also co-founded. You are a busy human being, but that's the way to make things happen. And they sort of complement each other. Tell me about GRAIN Ecosystem.
Well, GRAIN is where I spend the bulk of my time, obviously. GRAIN came out of a Dare to Disrupt challenge put on by Schneider Electric, which is a company, you mentioned. We were really fortunate to have their head of strategy and head of policy in attendance at our event. And basically, the whole point of GRAIN was, how do we bring clarity and scale to carbon removal? What we had envisioned over time was, as you know, in the United States, we have a lot of waste. There's a lot of potential for circular economy. We have major issues as it relates to our food supply, our soil systems, our water infrastructure. I think you got a chance to meet with a lot of hardware players in the biochar space at the event. And really, our platform at GRAIN is helping developers. And when I say developers, these are people that are typically waste producers, think sugar mills, lumber mills, timber mills, dairy farms, etc., and even states, obviously, like Rhode Island, develop models leveraging feasibility, measuring impact, and connecting with funding. Obviously, the beachhead, which we'll talk more about, is, of course, biochar, which has powerful co-benefits. But if I think about places that have touched my heart personally, I lived in the UAE, I lived in France, obviously, I'm in Manhattan now, Rhode Island, the Bahamas. We're trying to figure out, how do we unlock new value from waste and provide unprecedented and vital resilience against climate change that's going to boost food security. It's going to create jobs and sequester carbon. So whether it's restoring mangroves, strengthening island economies, or helping frontline communities scale solutions, GRAIN is turning vulnerability into vitality across climate, health, and other opportunities. So that's really our big focus. Obviously, again, we'll go a little bit deeper into the ecosystem as a whole, but that's what we're working on at GRAIN today.
So let's back up a little bit. Biochar. We're hearing a lot about it, and I don't think everybody appreciates or really fully understands what it is and what its role and potential role is. So how do you do this alchemy, turning waste, any kind of bio waste, into biochar? It's like turning water into wine.
Well, what's really cool is, at the StockTake event, you said you had some of the leading technologies in the world that actually make and manufacture pyrolysis and gasification machines. At the event, you had companies like RD, which is headquartered in Iowa, Pyreg, which is a German company but has a massive presence in the US, Local, who I don't know if you had a chance to check out their AR headsets to really kind of see how their technology is creating valued outputs. And then, of course, you had the head of the US Biochar Coalition, which is supporting with the policy work, this is the same group of individuals that help stand up the biogas industry. So first and foremost, you need those stakeholders to make and accelerate the biochar market, and GRAIN is kind of in the middle of all of it. But, biochar, what's cool about biochar is it plays a unique dual role. It locks carbon away for hundreds to potentially thousands of years, depending on the application, while also restoring degraded soils, as I mentioned earlier, improving water retention, increasing ag yields. And a lot of the biochar technology that exists can also create other byproducts, particularly electricity, which is really exciting because that's how you build resilience. You could create mini microgrids, etc. Very simply, though, all it is you're taking this organic waste, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's pistachio shells, walnut shells, different types of manure. There were folks at the event actually that are doing equestrian waste to biochar. There's a gentleman that came in from Palm Beach, Florida, that's turning equestrian waste into biochar, but you're heating that up at a high temperature in the absence of oxygen. And typically that's creating a solid, a liquid, and a gas as an output. And the biochar is typically the solid. And what's really cool about it is we're helping to build other markets. If you think about how you leverage it in the built environment, you can use biochar as an additive for concrete, steel, asphalt, and we're seeing other applications. Keep in mind, one of the things GRAIN is doing is helping to align biochar projects with carbon credits wherever possible, high quality, tangible, traceable, projects that have integrity, but not everything is eligible for carbon credits. And I think that's an important part of the story. But again, you've got a very unique firsthand view on biochar at that event, just by the scope and scale and nature of people that were there.
I came away with some presents too. I got a little pouch of biochar to fertilize my garden with.
Excellent.
And then what must be the liquid that you're talking about? I got a jar of liquid.
Yeah, soil
that I can
like
dilute.
a wood vinegar, a natural pesticide from Ecotone Renewables, which is a leading anaerobic digestion company.
And so my garden is experiencing a bit of a metamorphosis. I might actually get a tomato this year.
All right. Well, it's exciting. We'll monitor that and we can use it as a case study because we don't have enough live projects today.
Okay. Well, speaking of, is biochar, it's got all these benefits for your garden. Can the average person like me, can I get biochar somewhere? Is this something that I can access for my own home purposes?
You definitely can. I mean, there are wholesale plays in the biochar market. One of them is a company called Wakefield Biochar, but you can typically buy biochar on the shelves at Home Depot and Lowe's.
Okay.
We are also working with a number of companies that are composters. One of the big things that we've learned in this business, especially visiting the number of farmers all over the country that I have personally and the grain team has, composters play a massive role, and the ability to implement biochar as an additive to compost is a really big one. So the short answer is you can absolutely get it for yourself today. The thing that we do when we look at projects is we look at lab analysis to understand the carbon content, the pH balance, and really get a little bit deeper in terms of what does that comprehension look like in terms of the varying and underlying properties. Because when we look at a bigger project, obviously beyond what you would have in your garden, we have to understand those critical elements because those go into the carbon calculations that will determine the integrity of the project, the permanence of the project, and ultimately how many carbon credits that project is going to be eligible for over time. So I'm looking forward to seeing you buy more of that compost, and I could give you a lot of recommendations of companies that are leading there as well and looking to play a bigger role. And I would just say the last thing I would say, if you think about the composting market today, yard trimmings and food waste make up about 40 to 45%. Manure-based compost is second, and then tertiary, you have a lot of other applications that kind of fall in the middle tier. But when it comes to biochar, home gardening, landscaping, and horticulture are kind of the things that we're seeing. And there is a Maureen Walsh who leads the U.S. Biochar Coalition, who was at the event. One of the things they're helping with is under USDA and RCS, there's a incentive payment. It's called Code 336 that reimburses farmers to take biochar because composters typically have better connections with farmers than biochar producers. So getting composters educated to work with these incentive funds is really important.
Oh, that sounds
pretty cool.
Really interesting. When I lived in Portland, Maine, there was a service called Garbage to Garden, and they would take all of your compost weekly and put it in their giant compost. And I think it sounds like that would be they should get on the biochar bandwagon.
They really should.
And turn that. So it's a really interesting part in the whole circular cycle that a lot of people haven't really fully thought through. And then if there's a whole carbon credit aspect to it, let's get into that a little bit because we've been talking about carbon credits for a really long time. Soldiers have died on the sword of carbon credits, especially in the United States. I think these markets are a little bit more advanced in Europe. What does the carbon credit market look like in the United States, and how does that work?
Well, I think that, so just for the audience that maybe is a little bit newer, I mean, carbon credits are essentially permits that allow a company or country to emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases. And each credit typically represents 1 metric ton of CO2 or its equivalent, either removed from the atmosphere or prevented from being emitted, right? So you have a methane abatement as an example is an avoidance, where a biochar is a removal, or direct air capture is a removal, or mangroves is removal. So, and then you've got, to your point, compliance markets, which we obviously see with California cap and trade. And you've got voluntary markets, which is obviously, when you think about registries like Verra and Gold Standard and Isometric, these are registries that help project developers get access to voluntary markets. And not all, the big thing from my perspective is, of course, and GRAIN's perspective is not all credits are created equal. Some projects are rigorously verified and deliver measurable benefits. Others obviously have been criticized for overstating the impact or are susceptible to moral hazard. One of the things that caused a lot of the outrage early on was tied to some forestry projects where there were bad actors. Money wasn't going to the indigenous populations and communities. And then sometimes when you benchmark a project to another site, so you benchmark a forest to another forest, that can cause some real issues and consternation. And I think that's what ultimately makes a lot of people uneasy about carbon markets. One of the reasons I would just say, Abigail, that we picked biochar is when you think about the concept, and we'll go into this a little bit more later because it's at the core of one of the things GRAIN is doing, which is measure, MRV, measuring and reporting and verification. Biochar is really, really easy, comparatively speaking, when you look at some of the other methods that are out there to monitor. But just again, to give the audience perspective, there are 24 compliance markets globally, 7 or 8 more that are in development. The vision is by 2035, we are going to see, and I'm very excited about this, more of a intertwined relationship between the voluntary and regulatory markets, because you're going to have demand for 2 to 3 gigatons of carbon credits. So it's a very big opportunity, and biochar represents 93% of the voluntary carbon market. So we are seeing that the people moving fastest today around doing biochar projects are going to get the biggest return. And the last thing I'll just say on the U.S. right now is there are other states that are looking to model after the California cap and trade system. We see a lot of really cool things happening internationally. Obviously, the EU emissions trading scheme, what's happening with GX, ETS in Japan as a way to kind of merge these markets together. And everybody has their eyes on Brazil and COP30 to see what's going to happen with Article 6.4 and 6.2, mechanisms that will essentially bring the UN in and make it easier and more seamless for countries to trade carbon credits and do carbon projects together. So a little bit of my perspective, but there's roles to play for both, and the states are going to play, as they have continued to, a massive role in defining these carbon markets and how projects get done.
Now you're talking about the individual states. I'm wondering on a macro level if the federal policies are not as climate rigorous as a state like Rhode Island or Maine, how is that affecting GRAIN ecosystem and your community?
Well, the federal play is really important. Obviously, a lot of things are changing rapidly. It's been New York Energy Week this week, so I've been at a lot of discussions around what happens with IRA money and 48E tax credits and 45Q, which we were working hard to make that more tech neutral because 45Q is predominantly around direct air capture and carbon capture. The thing I will tell you as it relates to our space, which is the one that I can speak with the most confidence, is the work that we are doing is very, very, very bipartisan. We have great support. The biochar industry has great support from leaders like Sheldon Whitehouse in Rhode Island, who was a great advocate for our event, to Chuck Grassley I think he's in Iowa, and Bozeman and Baird that represent very strong Republican districts. And the folks that we're engaging with, a lot of them are in red states. They desperately have a waste problem. If I think about some of the content that we've created, anybody who's against circular economy applications, particularly the thematic, your waste is worth it. It's a hard one. It's hard to have policy whiplash there as it is with like hydrogen or wind farms, because you're taking these pain points, especially farmers are suffering with, and you're creating solutions. The cool thing is the voluntary market is just that. It's a voluntary market. Yeah. And we're seeing in the 4 years almost I've been doing this, I've never seen as much demand for biochar carbon credits. And again, one of the reasons is, quite frankly, and I talked about this on NASDAQ television the other day, a lot of direct air capture projects are not delivering in alignment with the expectation. So those buyers who are depending on retiring those credits are looking for other credits, because the Mammoth project that Climeworks was working on was supposed to deliver about 36,000 tons a year, I think. And today net, I think it's sequestered or removed about 700 tons. And then net, when you account for all of the intricacies in the supply chain that go into building it, I think it's only removed around 105 or 110 tons. So that's one of the reasons, again, we doubled down on biochar many years ago, is because it really solves a lot of problems and it's completely bipartisan.
What were the farmers doing before with all this waste?
Well, a lot of the waste was simply sitting on the field, decaying on the field. It was being burned in open burn piles, which is obviously not optimal for these environments. And then a lot of them, as you see, if you go on YouTube and you check out our Grain Ecosystem channel, one of my favorite sites to go to is a sugar mill in Louisiana. They have what's called Mount Bagasse. Bagasse is a byproduct of the process of producing sugar and crushing that cane. They've got a 4 million ton mountain of bagasse that they're spending millions of dollars to manage year in, year out. So a lot of these people are just stacking up these piles and having to manage them. And that's why with grain, we say, well, we're turning waste into value. So it's a multitude of those things, but ultimately it's a waste to value story. And if we can create economic revenue streams, if we can improve the biodiversity of the communities we're operating in, and ultimately sequester carbon in the process, it's a win. So that's really what it's all about, Abigail, at the end of the day for us.
For a blue economy to thrive, people need to use more sustainable products. But which products? And will consumers actually adopt them? Innovators like you are hustling to figure this out. Spark number 9 can tell you if there's demand for your product. Spark markets your product before it's built using online advertising so you launch smarter. Have a big idea? Vet it with Spark before you build. Visit Spark online at www.sparkno9.com or find them on LinkedIn. Well, it certainly sounds that way. And I think, we're all talking about circular economies and that can play out in different industries in a different way. But it definitely seems like we need to start really thinking about our waste in all tracks of our life and our economies so that we are getting all the benefit of it too.
Yeah.
Because
and I would say, just to put things in perspective, a lot of times it can seem like it's a massive undertaking, but I also want to highlight, like, across the stack, we have companies and states that are and can play a massive role. I'll give you 2 awesome examples, right? I was really lucky. I got a chance to meet with the chief technology officer of Carrier. Not a lot of people talk about HVAC systems, but just to give your audience a perspective, HVAC powers 70 million homes. HVAC powers 70 million homes worldwide. I'm trying to remember the statistics off the top of my head. 1 in 10 homes in the U.S., I believe, are at a minimum using air conditioning. And Carrier alone makes up 15% of the U.S. electricity grid. And they're working to advance grid interactive, battery integrated HVAC technologies that would rapidly reduce strain and build a virtual, I think he said, 100 gigawatt power plant over a decade. So that's one great example of resilience without relying on public policy. You've got a massive HVAC company with huge access. And then in New York State, where I'm living right now, you've got a groundbreaking project, the Champlain Hudson Power Express, hydropower. It's a 6 billion, 300 something mile underground water, underwater line that's going to bring renewable hydropower from Quebec to New York City. It's going to cut emissions drastically. It's going to power over 1 million homes, and it's going to help New York reach its 2030 energy targets, all while creating more jobs. So just want to highlight, I talk about it from the lens of circular economy and what communities are doing, but it's also, I always go back to this, even, the company that backed us early, Schneider Electric, which was Time Magazine's most sustainable company in the world. There are companies and states that can do such great things with that magic if they just double down and get creative and get innovative.
Yeah. No, I love your position in it because Grain Ecosystem really gets this bird's eye perspective, and you're connecting all these players together to maximize the opportunities. And that is an incredible position to be in. And it definitely seems like biochar has that traceability element that has been lacking in some of these other carbon markets. So you mentioned you're going to get into more measuring, reporting, and verification. Can you tell me just a little bit about how you do that?
Well, it's a key element because one of the things Grain does is we help biochar projects secure funding. And how do we do that? We simplify and de-risk the process. So the platform guides developers, as I said earlier, as Tom Steyer would say, in a better, faster, cheaper way through things like feasibility modeling, life cycle impact assessments, and getting them ready for the right capital stack. And typically that's a mix of non-dilutive, concessionary capital, carbon credits, equity, etc. But in order to do these projects and maintain integrity and protect the cash flows, MRV is critical. And the real barrier that I see today in doing these projects isn't necessarily the lack of ideas or local commitment, but it's the absence of the right financial architecture, and then it's fragmented execution, weak monitoring, reporting, and verification. So what GRAIN has done is we have, building on the expertise and leadership we have on the front end of the stack to get projects ready, and starting to hear from a lot of investors say, why isn't GRAIN also protecting the integrity of these projects over the long term? We recently launched we call it Build and Operate, where we're integrating into the OEM, of course, through via API integration. And we're doing a lot of very, very unique things that enable a project and unlock projects to be successful. So if you look at a typical project dashboard and you think about some of the stuff that we highlighted, it's a comprehensive monitoring and management system. We've got real-time monitoring. We do IoT integration that collects real-time data on feedstock, energy use and emissions. We streamline the carbon verification and traceability. So we've kind of standardized that carbon credit templates with the enterprise system integration for full material and carbon traceability. So we're providing all the critical documentation to the registry on behalf of the project developer in perpetuity, because a lot of these projects can generate carbon credit revenue for 21 and up to 30 years. And then we're ensuring not only that regulatory compliance, but we're maximizing the yields and additional revenue streams as we go, because we're watching the biochar revenue streams. We're partnering with Schneider Electric on our, RECs, renewable energy certificates, or power purchase agreements, or just reducing that OpEx cost to do the core electricity. And then the last thing is obviously the integrations, integrating with ERP systems, inventory management systems. It's all in service of, ensuring that we are optimizing and streamlining the whole process and continuing to stay on top of these projects. So it's, embedding this evidence collection into workflows is going to ensure that credits are issued on time, projects avoid cost overruns and delays, and we're maximizing efficiency, reducing risk, and driving profitability for these projects.
I think that makes a ton of sense. You're really there to help optimize at the end.
Exactly right.
And you can get them from, 0 to 100 a lot faster because you understand the metrics that work.
Exactly.
So I think that's incredibly, incredibly insightful. So you mentioned financing. How do you guys get finance? What's your model?
Well,
or do you have investors? How did you get off the ground?
Yeah, so GRAIN is venture backed. I was really proud, actually. We just recently, about a month and a half ago, I'm losing track of the days now, announced the successful funding of our seed round. So as I mentioned, we were really fortunate in our pre-seed round, which was led by Schneider Electric Ventures. I think we were the first ever pre-seed bet that they've made. We gotta double check on that, but I think so. And they've been an amazing partner. And then this past round was led by a group called Elevate Ventures. They're the largest venture capital firm in Indiana. I met them through an event that I participated in last year called Rally Innovation. It's given me a lot of great ideas, actually, for work we can do in Rhode Island. But it was their team led by a gentleman named Christopher Day, Tove Day, puts on just really, really passionate and engaging events that give people the chance to pitch and ideate, etc. But one of the cool things is Indiana is an ag state. It didn't take them long to see the value proposition and understand kind of, hey, what GRAIN is doing to be supportive there. And there were a number of other, venture shops and angel investors that are very active in the space. So we will continue to hopefully grow and scale and bring on, venture leadership and other, climate advocates to support to support the GRAIN train as we keep going forward.
That's great. So what's the big vision? Like, where do you want to take all of this?
Oh my God. That's the question. That's the question du jour. I mean, that's the thing I think about all the time. Obviously, with your goal and your objective of thinking about a happier planet, for me, I remain cautiously optimistic. I think only if we confront reality with both a sense of urgency and honesty is how we're going to get there. So I think that on one hand, we have to stay grounded and rooted in the fact that physics, supply chains, and timeframes matter, and wishful thinking won't get us there. And I'm doing everything I can, both at GRAIN and certainly individually from an education perspective, to ensure that we are transitioning in a safe way that aligns with modern life. And the realization is, and you saw this at the stock take, we're not powerless. The tools exist, the technologies are there. Clearly, capital is ready to be deployed. We see it getting deployed at scale, whether it's nuclear fusion, it's direct air capture, it's other elements. We saw it with solar, wind storage, and geothermal. And there's a growing global movement demanding change, especially when the economics align. So with the right investments and policies, we're going to have a more equitable and resilient economy. And we just want to be at the core of uplifting these communities along the way.
Listeners may remember Patrick Breeding, who was on our show last year to talk about Marin Skincare and its clinically proven formula that uses glycoproteins from Maine lobsters to treat eczema and dry, damaged skin. This company has since become wildly successful with this lobster lotion, and Patrick is inviting listeners to a 20% discount on their products by using the coupon code HAPPYPLANET on their website, marinskincare.com. I use this product myself, and I highly recommend it. As an entrepreneur, you're in these sort of two different spaces. They're a little similar, the Fountainhead and GRAIN Ecosystem. Your role is really about building these communities. One, you have more of a technical role, the other more of a sort of community building role. But actually in both of them, you really are building these communities. What are the benefits and what are some of the challenges of having two projects that you're lifting at the same time?
I think the only limit to the impact I can have personally is certainly imagination and commitment. I think I've got both of those in spades. I've had to get a lot better over time, Abigail, at saying no, because at the end of the day, my focus is if we can be successful and continue the success we've had with GRAIN, we're going to have massive amounts of impact. In the early days, the goal at GRAIN was we wanted to be responsible for helping to sequester 0.5 gigaton of removals. And certainly we are slowly but surely getting our way there. I think, being a nonprofit entrepreneur is very different from running a private, company. For, both the similarities are you have a mission, you still have a mission and impact, but at Fountainhead, we're not as focused on profit. Our success is measured by social or environmental outcomes. And one of the things I'm working on there is just to, highlight our body of work to drive in more grants and donations and, things that are going to build the relationships, both to bridge the gap between Gen Z, certainly Gen X and millennials, et cetera, because we have a massive, the difference at Fountainhead is we have a massive set of stakeholders with lots of different ideas. So scaling there means expanding impact versus revenue, where, obviously at GRAIN, we're looking to get, triples and doubles. We have to get to profitability. I believe in today's environment, it's really important that startups exhibit not only a pathway to large multiples, but also profitability, and maybe be in a position where you don't have to continually raise on a traditional cycle. So I think that's really important. And then I would just say that, the passion I've got, and I think the passion's come across for many, many years in these fields, it gives me the energy, but the structure and my co-founders help to give me the direction as well. And I would just end by saying, managing multiple projects at once comes down to those things. And if you emphasize that passion enough, for these projects, I continue to, kind of had that energy and focus. And sometimes when I lose that a bit, that's why we have these live events, right? Because the events reinvigorate you. When you go to the stock take or when you go to the, GRAIN, we hosted the first ever biochar carbon revolution during Climate Week last year on a rooftop. It was absolutely jam-packed. So it's important to have those in-person elements to reinvigorate you if you do feel that some of those energy levels coming down. That's the beauty of building an ecosystem in a community and, just continuing to keep that deep focus with strategic overview, leaning on that support network, staying motivated by the meaningful impact each project can create, and then doing incredible talks with people like yourself that we can memorialize and go back to help kind of think through the next steps in the future and what it looks like and iterate to be better.
Do you have any specific advice that you maybe like to give at these events or that you have in mind for entrepreneurs in your ecosystem?
Well, one of the things and I specifically did this for a reason, and it was obviously we bit off a lot with it, was hosting the pitch competition. at the climate stock take. And the reason I wanted to do that is, because of the diverse folks in the room. And again, a lot of people in states like Rhode Island, Vermont, Maine that are founders in those states don't get the visibility that they should. I got very lucky I left Rhode Island when I was very young, and I've been able to add more value to my home state by being out of it. And I could bring leaders and investors from all over the world. So I would just say that for the entrepreneurs out there, the challenges we're solving, particularly in climate, demand outside the box thinking and really cross-disciplinary collaboration. And I think it's really important to double down on emotional intelligence. I think we need that more than ever. There was an article I was reading in I think it was The Economist or the Financial Times. They're really talking about, AI is going to play a role, but the ability to get in person and engage with key stakeholders is really, really important. I'm on the record saying this a lot of times. You have to be able to make reversible decisions quick and irreversible decisions deliberate. I live by that. It's played a huge role for me, both in corporate, at the nonprofit level, on boards, and of course at GRAIN Ecosystem. But, at the end of the day, fixing the planet is just good business. And I think that you have to, if you want to go and raise capital, remember that, be contrarian, don't hesitate to play your own devil's advocate, and seek out. One of the best things for me is I'm part of the New York City Founders Club. There's very few, if any, founders in that group that are doing anything remotely similar to me or in climate. So they help unearth blind spots and false confidence. So if you really want to drive creativity and boldness, and look at transformative ways of doing things, get engaged with other entrepreneurs that are completely outside your wheelhouse and scope. And that's going to, a lot of times, help you get through sticking points. That collaborative spirit is absolutely something that has paid huge dividends for me and many founders that have done way more, whether they've gone Series B, C, or public. So I would say that.
I think that's really insightful, because we all need to get out of our comfort zones and our bubbles. Because if we're just bouncing ideas off people who see the world from the same exact perspective that we do, we're not going to be challenged, and we're not going to grow. I do think it's an opportunity to see a lot of blind spots. So finally, are you optimistic with respect to the planet?
Well, sticking with the thematic, and by the way, I love the name of your podcast. People were buzzing about it, the Happy Planet podcast. I think, to build a truly sustainable and happier planet, which is a core thematic, obviously, of your work, we have to shift from passive sustainability work to active resilience. I live and breathe resilience. I think that's the way we're going to get it done. Whether it's, as I said earlier, New York to Rhode Island to the Bahamas, all of which were engaged at the event. The threats are real. So you've got coastal flooding, rising seas, hurricane damage, infrastructure at risk. Half of Manhattan's population lives in a floodplain. Rhode Island faces, I was talking about this with the climate team at the event, I think it was up to 9 or 9.5 feet of sea level rise by 2100. The Bahamas, obviously, if you talk to them at all at the event, we're talking a lot about Hurricane Dorian, Category 5. They had over 1 million tons of biomass debris. But what ties these regions together, and similarities across the world, is the urgent need for nature-based circular economy solutions like biochar. And I would say this, with the right solutions and technologies at scale, you can sequester a significant amount of carbon and improve soil health, boost drought resilience, increase yields, drive more employment, more innovation, more management. So again, as I said earlier, I'm cautiously optimistic. Obviously, one of my favorite authors is Vaclav Smil, and I try to be rooted as much as I can in the numbers. We see the biochar market going to 6 or 6.5 billion by 2030. It's not fast enough. And I would just tell the audience to, with a question like this, look at the examples. Look at what countries are doing. I gave a few examples earlier, but the Netherlands as an example, they're investing $1.5 billion annually in flood resilience to really use that natural infrastructure to protect erosion there. Companies like Google and IKEA are locking in clean energy to beat volatility. Intel and Pepsi are trying to build water resilience into their core operations. So I really look to what's happening on the ground, both from our unique work at GRAIN Ecosystem and what bigger companies and states and countries are doing to point in the direction. But ultimately, if we're going to get to a happier planet, it's a planet where nothing is wasted, where communities thrive alongside nature, and where the solutions to today's crises are built from within. And I'm convinced, at least in our world at GRAIN, biochar and waste to energy, what I'm seeing is a lot of optimism to help turn that vision into reality. restoring balance, creating opportunity, improving that regeneration is really not only possible, but powerful.
Amen. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for coming. This has been an absolute delight. And I just wish you the best of success and stay in touch.
Likewise to you, Abigail. You made the event such a big success, and we were grateful to have you there.